Hey everybody, welcome to Talk-A-Raptor episode 11. This is Talk-A-Raptor. Now before I get on to my unbiased review of the Ocarina of Time, I do want to give you a little background on my gaming history, because the Ocarina of Time is a little old, even by my humble standards. So first off, I got the Nintendo Entertainment System around 1992. This was followed up by the Super Nintendo around 1997. And then finally, the only other console I own is the PlayStation 2, which I got around 2002. So this skipped the generation with the Nintendo 64, also the PlayStation 1 and the Sega Dreamcast. However, I do have a little bit of experience from that generation because I played Final Fantasy 7 through 9 on my PlayStation 2. Now, as far as the Zelda series is concerned, I did play a little bit of the Nintendo-era Zelda games on my computer. However, they all really sucked, so I dropped them pretty quickly. The only other Zelda game I've played to completion is A Link to the Past, which I've graded on my site as a double plus. So even though the Ocarina of Time is a little old, it's the latest entry in the Zelda series that I've actually played. So now that you know exactly where I stand, let's get on to the review. Let's start out with the three things that sucked. First of all, this game is a total clone of Link to the Past. I got a comment on my recent Okami post from a guy who believed that the game ripped off the Zelda series, and after playing the Ocarina of Time, yes, there are definitely many elements that are borrowed, but Okami was still a very original game. The Ocarina of Time, on the other hand, borrowed from Link to the Past, lock, stock, and barrel from start to finish. Now, I realize some video game franchises are going to cling to their staples more than others, and the Zelda series is one of those that really clings a lot. It's always Link versus Ganon. You're traveling through Hyrule. You get the Master Sword, the hookshot, the boomerang, a whole bunch of other abilities. That much is fine. I'm perfectly happy to allow that. But then you get to the two-world setup. You have to collect 3 items to get the Master Sword, then you go to the New World, and you have to beat a certain number of dungeons to save a corresponding number of sages who will allow you to beat Ganon. That's where the game really should have tried to be more original. Plus, it always looks bad when you're copying from someone, and yet the person you're copying from still manages to pull it off better. There are a bunch of things I liked much better in Link to the Past. For example, traveling between the two worlds was really slick. There were a whole bunch of places you could do it, and there was a lot of flexibility. In Link to the Past, there's only one place you can travel through time. It's a total pain in the ass. You always had to go there, and hope you have an Ocarina song to teleport you out, otherwise you gotta take the scenic route. There were also a bunch of tools I like better in Link to the Past. For example, the hookshot. The hookshot in Link to the Past did everything. If you're just looking at the Ocarina of Time in isolation, yeah, the hookshot's pretty cool. But if you're comparing it to Link to the Past, it sucks. There are only a few specifically designated surfaces that you can use the hookshot on, and everything else is completely useless. Also, you need to get an upgrade for the hookshot. That's ridiculous. It's a complete waste of a dungeon treasure. Then look at the mirror shield. In A Link to the Past, it's the size of his body. Now that's a shield. In the Ocarina of Time, we get this. Like, what the hell is this supposed to do? Alright, let's just move on. Okay, so the second thing that sucked was that this game was just way too linear. Those of you who know my site know that I love time travel, and so I was really looking forward to this game. But once you go to the future for the first time, you're only required to go back in time twice. That's it. Now, there are a few other side quests that you can do that involve time travel, and the whole bunch that I didn't even try. I'm going to get to that later. But twice. Once for that annoying magnifying glass thing, and once for that desert dungeon. That's it. It's a horrible waste of a great premise. And the third thing that sucked is Navi. Oh, where do I begin? I like the idea of a fairy sidekick / hint character, but this game just executed it really poorly. She would say the most obvious things at the most irrelevant times, and way too often she'd end up telling you what you can't do rather than what you can do. In fact, you know what? Right now I'm going to write her up for the Useless Character Hall of Shame. For hindrance, she doesn't really get in your way so much as she just wastes your time. So I'm only going to give her a 2 out of 10 for this, but I'm going to give her a 6 out of 10 for filler. Talentlessness? Oh boy, that's a 10 out of 10. Failure? 10. Disappointment? 10. Total? 38 out of 50. Thankfully, we get to change pace a bit and talk about the 3 things that rocked. First of all, Link's harem. Wow, good for him. Usually you're pretty hard-pressed to find a harem with 2 girls I like, but in this harem, there are actually 3 that I have a pretty high opinion of. My ranking is as follows. At the top, Malon. Then Zelda, then Saria. After that, it's Ruto, and if you want to count Navi, you can put her dead last. Malon's obviously the best. She's got a good head on her shoulders, she lives in a gigantic ranch in the geographic center of the world, she gives you a free horse, a free cow, and she calls you Fairy Boy, which is strangely suggestive. Zelda's pretty cool in that she actually does something instead of just getting captured the whole time. I had Saria ranked above Zelda in the past, But once you get to the future, at least she has a nice personality. Unlike Ruto, who makes you carry her around. On the bright side, you can throw her. And then there's Navi. Well, 3 out of 5 ain't bad. Overall, a solid harem. The second thing that rocked? The dungeon design. Especially in the adult world, these are some very well constructed dungeons. Some games seem to think they have great dungeons because they're really, really long. But there's nothing fun or creative about that, it's just a lot of bitch work. It's nothing more than a really big maze. And in a maze, there's only one right way, and everything else is filler. In Zelda's dungeons, you're not wondering, did I turn left at the right place? Did I turn right at the right place? Did I go straight at the right place? In Zelda, every single path is the right path at some point in the dungeon. There's no wasted space, and each pathway fits into the grander design of the dungeon. There are a bunch of other games I've played that seem to use this same kind of dungeon design principle, such as the Devil May Cry and God of War series. But I'd still say that Zelda does it the best of any game I've played, and this is coming from a guy in 2013. Just imagine how mind-blowing this must have been in 1998, especially with its creative use of the third dimension. Right, Navi? And the third thing that rocked were the zombies. Now, the other game had mummies and zombies and stuff like that, but in this game they were actually scary. And it's always so much more exciting when you're playing a game against enemies that you're scared to go up against. This is also a perfect example of how action RPGs can be so much more exciting than the turn-based kind. Sure, turn-based RPGs can have scary enemies in terms of character design, but can they actually slowly creep up to you and frighten the shit out of you? With the exception of the Tonberry, I have yet to see it happen. Now, on to the 3 things I was indifferent about. First of all, the Ocarina. I was expecting it to have some sort of combat value, but aside from fighting the zombies, there's really no use for it in battle, and half of the songs are just teleportation. It's still pretty fun to use, but there's really nothing special about it. Second thing I'm indifferent about, the graphics. I imagine they were pretty kick-ass for their time, but right now, they're pretty ugly, the Great Fairy's rack aside. In any case, graphics rarely matter to me, at least in an aesthetic sense. The more important question is whether the old-school 3D graphics interfered with the gameplay, and that really only happened a few times. First of all, the bats. Oh my god, the bats. I hated those things. By the time you get close enough to Z-target them, they're already flying right into your face. The other thing that really sucked was when you had to find a specific patch of ground to either plant a bean into or to play your Ocarina on. Unless you stood at the exact right angle, you could not see them at all. And I'm not sure whether this was a problem with the emulator, or whether this problem also existed on the N64. Still, when you take everything into consideration, having only a few major problems with the graphics is pretty impressive for the time frame. The final thing I'm indifferent about are the side quests. This game doesn't shove its side quests in your face, so if all you want to do is beat the game straight through, as I did, you're perfectly free to do that. However, I really didn't participate in many of the side quests at all, just one to get the Kukos to get the jar, and I also got the ultimate sword. I planted a few of the beans, but I didn't even go back to get most of them. I just saw whatever was in my way, and planted it when I got the chance. The gold sculptures were kind of annoying, but at least you got partial credit for partial completion, unlike the stray beads in Okami. That about wraps things up. My final grade for the game is a double plus. This is based mainly on the dungeon design, which remains excellent to this day. It's also based on the variety of tools in the game, which aren't as good as Link to the Past, but are still very fun to play with. Most of the other features of the game aren't remarkable by today's standards, but had to have been great back when the game came out. One final note before we go, even though my website's been around for 7 years, I never had a hat until now. You see, I went to this place called the Gordon Brothers.